Welcome back, APUSH class. I wanted to get into some of the nuts and bolts, some of the more fine detail on this. Some of this stuff relates back to last time. That's fine. You hear it a few times, it's not an issue. So, this is my first part of New Deal legislation. Keep in mind, most of this happened very, very rapidly. This was something that had never been done by the U.S. government. The U.S. government had never tried to stop a major economic recession or depression before, and we weren't exactly sure what to do. So a lot of this is very much a put it in the shotgun, fire it against the wall, see what sticks approach. Some of it worked, some of it really didn't. And it's important that we look at both to understand why we approach policy the way we do today. All right. So first things first, we talked last time about the banking crisis. Roosevelt's very first thing upon entering office was to deal with this situation. The U.S. banking system was on an imminent state of collapse. Banks were going under. It was likely that within a week they might all go under. It was that bad. People had started to panic, seeing banks fail, and they'd started to pull their money out. This is something called running on the banks. And when all the people who have deposited money pull it out, hey, guess what? A bank fails, even if it's a fundamentally strong one. So what you've got going on here is a situation where, you know, the failure of some banks caused people to panic and look to their own self-interest, and their own self-interest is, I want my money in my hands. And that is largely what created the really bad situation. So how do you stop a run on the banks? You close all the banks. And that's exactly what he did. By closing the banks, declaring a quote-unquote bank holiday, for a period of time, you're able to stop people from getting access to the money, stop the banks from failing, and then do something to reassure people and, you know, restore confidence. This never entirely worked. Again, growing up, I knew a lot of older sort of World War II Depression era people who did not trust banks and still kept their money in mattresses or jars or whatnot, which is not a great proposition, because if you keep your money in your mattress and somebody steals it, then it's gone for good. There is no recourse to that. If you have your money in a bank and the bank fails, FDIC takes care of it. But I remember a lot of people who grew up in that era who were not entirely trusting of banks. And that was a common mindset. So Roosevelt was never able to quite restore 100% faith in the banks, but he restored enough that they were able to keep going and functioning, and the banking system survived and grew out of the Depression. So again, the passage of the Emergency Banking Act basically is a bailout package. You heard of these before. Basically, we're going to throw some money at the most endangered institutions to keep them from failing. They will pay us back later. That's how these always work. They're basically emergency loans. This was done in 2008 as well. This is always controversial because it's always looked at as bailing out the wealthiest, most responsible for the problems, and there's some truth to that. But the alternative is letting the banks fail, which is way, way worse. So typically when push comes to shove, we will throw monies at big banks and big corporations to prevent them from going bankrupt. I don't love it, but it is what it is. And then, as I mentioned before, the Glass-Steagall Act. The most important thing it does is establish the FDIC, Federal Depository Insurance Corporation, which is, again, what protects your money you've got deposited in the bank. We talked about that a little bit last time. Remember, it also forces banks to divide investment banking from regular banking, so they cannot use their investors' money to invest in stocks and speculate and all that sort of stuff. Remember, that's part of Glass-Steagall was torn down in the 90s and is largely responsible for why the banking crisis happened in 2008. Some of these regulations have been put back in, probably not enough. But that's a question for another day. All right. Now, in terms of the industry piece, we have the National Recovery Act. This is one of those misses for the most part. The National Recovery Act was trying to create a situation where competition was reaffirmed and prices were controlled and all that stuff so that it wouldn't cause problems for the average person. The problem is that most of the corporations that this would have been regulating were heavily involved in writing it. And when that happens, regulatory rules don't always work out very well, at least didn't. It ended up actually driving up prices. It ended up sort of helping corporations get quasi-monopolies. It was not a great piece of legislation. It is one of those failures. It is definitely something worth remembering here when we talk about the New Deal. Yeah, there were a couple of pieces of this broad legislation that worked, but generally speaking, it didn't work very well. All right, moving on to public works. We talked about this last time. The idea here is let's do things for the country that are long-term beneficial infrastructure improvements and are going to put people to work at a fairly low rate now. The government gets things built on the cheap. Everybody benefits from that, and the people that are working get something. It beats the hell out of waiting at a soup kitchen and losing your house and living in a Hooverville in New York. So again, we talked about the Civilian Conservation Corps last time. They were used all over the country to do, usually wilderness projects, building roads in the wilderness, drainage improvements, that kind of thing. Typically young, unmarried men, 16 to 25-year-olds sent out into the woods and doing manual labor with shovels. We're not talking about a lot of heavy equipment here. Talking shovels and crowbars and pickaxes and that kind of stuff. They built some pretty impressive stuff considering a lot of their work is still in National Forest. Okay, we got that. The Public Works Administration is a really big one. This is a huge amount of government money that gets funneled into big public works projects, large-scale road system improvements, harbor improvements, you name it, money's being funneled into this. Now, this works on a lot of levels. Again, infrastructure improvements are necessary for an industrial economy. You can't not have a system to move goods around the country. You can't not protect your industrial infrastructure from flood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what it's doing is it's taking government money, and who is it going to? Well, it's going to construction companies who are building the thing, because this wasn't just all done by government workers. And two, those companies have to pay people, have to hire people to work. It's going straight to them. So this worked on a lot of levels. This was sort of companies being helped and individuals being helped. Were the wages great? No, they weren't. But boy, it beat the hell out of being unemployed. And this one was around for quite some time. This put a lot of money into the U.S. and a lot of projects that, again, still benefit you today, including many around here. We don't even notice many of them. A lot of the Army Corps of Engineers flood work, you don't even know, but there's dams around here that are designed specifically to create ponds that catch water before it becomes a flood. They're all over the North Country. They're all over here, and nobody ever notices them, but that's what they are. And a lot of them come out of this era. And then we mentioned, of course, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is sort of an arm of this. This is an attempt to put government money and government resources behind the large-scale production of electricity. Electrical power had been around for 40 years at this point, 40, 50 years, and yet there were large chunks of rural America that had no electricity. Especially in the area of Tennessee, Kentucky, and whatnot. And so what they did, they said, that's a problem. It holds back development because you can't really build effective modern factories without electricity. So what we're going to do is we're going to build these hydro dams and electrify this sort of central Midwest area. Worked beautifully. Those dams are still around today, making money for their owners and keeping electricity in those regions. Similar models have been taken up here. We didn't have a massive Tennessee Valley Authority for Upper New England, but if you look at the Connecticut River Valley, both Moore Dam and Cumberford Dam were built to create energy in this also underserved area a few years later. It was in the 1950s. But they are important aspects. The economy doesn't function back then without electricity and roads. Nowadays, the modern example is, of course, internet. High-speed internet is vital for the success or failure of the economy in an area now. One of Vermont's big issues is providing internet to its people. It's sort of the same idea. All right, down here, I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but we've got the topic of agriculture, and we have the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which, again, tried to control prices for farmers and improve conditions for farm. Basically, it was this sort of economic stimulus for specifically for farmers. Remember, we talked about the fact that in the 20s, it wasn't like farmers were doing great. The post-World War I slump had hit the farming industry very, very hard. A lot of Midwestern farmers were not doing well. And so there was an attempt to control prices. Unfortunately, they also had to deal with the Dust Bowl, which is a really nasty, and as you can see, there's a picture. That picture of gray is a farm out in Kansas during the Dust Bowl. It's basically a period where over-farming combined with a string of very dry summers had really caused the topsoil in the area of the Midwest to pick up and blow away and turn into dust. And this dust was spread all over states like Oklahoma. And what it did was it killed cattle. They breathed it in and died. It buried farms in dust, killed all the crops, destroyed cars, destroyed farms, destroyed all kinds of stuff. People left these areas and never returned. A lot of the reason California has the population it does is that most of the people who were sort of farming in the Midwest who left because of the Dust Bowl ended up landing there because the Californian economy was better than most. But a big reason why LA has the population it has is these people who left during this period. So that's another issue, and that was just a matter of changing the rules, and that's a long-term effect. You cannot overfarm. You cannot, if you own a lot of land, you have to put windbreaks, which are strings of trees in between the fields. If you ever drive through farm country, you'll see them. You're not allowed to sort of burn out farmland and then buy more. There's a whole bunch of restrictions of what you can and cannot do for farms, and it's because of the Dust Bowl. That's its reason. Okay, we will pick up on the next alphabet soup video in a little bit. Thank you very much, and stay safe.